Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Becky, and today we're going to have some fun and we're going to play with some crappy art supplies. I found these art supplies. I had taken them out of the original box. I think they came in a kids art supply thing. They have an S on the front, and I think that it came with this spice box paper. And we're going to try it out. They do not look like high quality, and we're going to see what happens when you play with poor quality watercolor on low quality watercolor paper. Excuse that noise. It's my cat. She found something on the floor and she's playing with it. Alrighty, we're going to start off looking at the paper here. Let me set these paints aside. This is the paper that I'm using. This is Spice Box. It is supposed to be 140 pounds. I do not believe that it's 140 pounds. It's a little thin for 140 pounds, but we'll give it a try. I'm going to just go ahead and take this out of here. You can see that it's kind of flopping over very easily. So I'm not really sure that's 140 pounds, but we will play with this. Looks like it's got a tiny bit of texture. It looks a little bit more like a hot press than a cold press to me. But I am not a watercolor expert. I just want to play with this stuff and see if you can make anything good with it. Like I said, this came from what I believe was a child's art kit. We all know that the quality in those are sometimes not great. So we're going to start off by swatching all of these colors. I'm not going to, well, I'll swatch the white, but oh, let's see. First off, I'm a little bit surprised. I was expecting the color to be a little bit less vibrant. So I did not wet these. Let me start by wetting them first to activate them, because that's how you're supposed to use watercolor. Let's let that sit. Okay. I am using just a plain old water brush here, just because I'm feeling lazy and didn't feel like getting my real brush. The white doesn't show up too much, but that's expected. Ooh, this pink is white light. There's not much color there. You can see that I spritzed them with water, but like this one's already looking very dry. It looks like it just kind of soaked up that water, and there's not much to it. It almost looks soapy when you're scrubbing it a little bit, which is kind of weird. It looks soapy when you put it down too. Just showing you a quick opacity test here. You can see that most of them are pretty transparent. A couple of them are a little bit more opaque than others, but that's to be expected from watercolors. This paper is definitely not great paper. The next thing I'm going to try lifting a little bit and just see how well that works. Partially to test the watercolors themselves and partially to test the paper. I'm really having to scrub at this, and it is not really coming off, and I believe the watercolor paper is, yeah, oh yeah, the watercolor paper is definitely just disintegrating. I mean, none of that means that you can't make good art with this, but it does mean that you get what you pay for. Just seeing how much I can pull. It dries very, very quickly. and doesn't want to pull too much. I'm definitely seeing pilling. I'm going to try a little wet on wet here. Make that a little bit wet, and we'll now toss in a bit of this green. Get a little bit of movement, but the pigment just kind of wants to stay where I put it. You can see a little bit of the capillary action where the water is pulling stuff around. You can kind of see it moving a little bit. It's definitely not behaving quite the way you might want it to. See if I drop in another color. Get some water, brush a little bit wetter. If that makes any difference. Oh, that one's spreading a little bit better. Maybe I just needed to have my brush a little wetter. I don't know. How about kind of a reasonable dry brush technique? You can see the texture of the paper a little bit through there. There's a very light texture. So, yeah, interesting. And what happens if I try to, I don't know, glaze this green on top of the purple? Just curious. That was probably a poor choice of colors. Paper definitely does not like having water on it. You can see filling in here already, and that was just a second light layer of color on top of that. So yeah, definitely not great paper. The 140 pound, I believe, is a lie. It is maybe it is 140 pounds, but it's very poor quality paper. But let's go ahead and see if we can make like a loose floral or something with this, just for funsies. So I will be back. So earlier I mentioned how this says it's 140 pound and how it's very thin. And so I went and looked around, and I have some 140 pound Canson watercolor paper. And here's what it sounds like. And you can see that it is, well, maybe you can see, I can tell that it's much thicker. And here's what the other 140 pound watercolor paper, the other 140 pound watercolor paper sounds like. You can see it's really, really floppy. You can see it just kind of flops over, whereas this doesn't really want to flop over nearly as much. So this paper is really cheap, and I do not believe that it's 140 pound. After considering how to proceed with these watercolors and the watercolor paper that I was trying out, I decided that I would make a couple of bookmarks. This is with the Spice Box, supposedly 140 pound watercolor paper. And this one over here is Canson watercolor paper. Unfortunately, the footage for this got messed up. At one point, I moved my hand too close to the camera, and it decided to zoom way in, and it was zoomed in on the washi tape off to the side, so we only have a few minutes of footage of me doing the paintings. But the idea here is that I was going to create 2 bookmarks of loose florals and do basically the same painting on each. I end up doing a few more flowers on the right-hand side. That's the Canson watercolor paper, the better paper, but it's the same techniques on both. I'm putting a dot of color down and then getting my paintbrush just a little bit damp and pulling the color out to make the petals. I will then sometimes go back in and put a little bit more color in the middle if I felt like the petals were a little bit too pale for my liking. and then I will put a little bit of a brown in the middle for the pollen in the middle, and then I draw some petals, or sorry, I draw some stems on there, and I end up putting some grass and sky in there because I just felt like it needed it for the layout. I don't do any wet on wet techniques. I definitely don't do any lifting because during my testing I found that the cheap watercolor paper just could not handle that. So for a very simple painting like this, it held up pretty well. It held up just as well as the Canson watercolor paper, but definitely if I wanted to do anything more advanced than something like this, it would not hold up. All right, I've given them time to dry. Now let's go ahead and peel the tape off and see if there's any differences in terms of how well that peels off. Remember, this side is the cheaper watercolor paper. This is the Canson watercolor paper. So looking at it, it doesn't look too bad. I did feel it pulling the paper up just a little bit, but it's not obvious damage, so not bad. And I didn't use a lot of water, so you're not seeing any warping here. But we already knew that this paper doesn't deal with water very well, so I didn't want to put a lot of water on there. And there is my cat, Miss Moxie. Yeah, the Canson just feels like it is pulling off much cleaner. It's really nice. And I can certainly pull much faster without feeling like I'm going to rip the paper. So the only issue I had with the Canson was in the corner here. I got a little bit of a split, and I'm not really sure why that is. Um, but yep, these are the two finished pieces. In terms of how they look pretty similar. So I would say that even if you just have some rather inexpensive, inexpensive watercolors and inexpensive watercolor paper, you can make some nice things. Like I said, the inexpensive watercolor paper definitely did not take well to a lot of techniques. You couldn't really do any lifting with them. You couldn't do wet on wet with it, or any kind of scrubbing on it. It would pill up. Whereas Canson watercolor paper will definitely take that uh, type of activity much better. So if you can afford better watercolor paper and can't afford high quality watercolors, then go for the better watercolor paper from what I can see. And that is the same advice that I have heard time and again from other YouTubers. So that's what I figured out just from my experimentation here. So do with that what you will. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and think about subscribing. All right, well, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.